I am here at the OEH annual meeting in Sacramento interviewing panelists from the session Where Are the Fun Girls? Could you please introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Valerie Paley. I'm director of the Center for Women's History at the New York Historical Society, where I'm also the chief historian.
I'm Joanna Scutts. I'm the former Mellon postdoctoral fellow in women's history at the New York Historical Society.
I'm Sarah Litvin. I'm the early career workshop coordinator and the former Mellon predoctoral fellow.
And I'm Sarah Gordon. I'm a curatorial scholar at the Center for Women's History.
What are the key takeaways for teachers from your session?
I think that what we tried to do with Where Are the Fun Girls, and also the focus of that, which was a interactive that we did that is on permanent view at New York Historical, is a interactive called Women's Voices. And what it does is it shows these connections between historical characters, women, and their points of intersection. So I think that pedagogically we would like for teachers to not replace a pantheon of great men with great women, but rather see the sort of intersectionality among people and the events which they bore witness, and women in particular in the historical narrative. Wouldn't you say something along those lines?
Absolutely, absolutely. We also, the interactive has many biographical profiles, but we also included profiles of groups and events. And the idea was that women's history isn't only a story of individuals and individual efforts and success, as sometimes people like to talk about progress in history, that it's really also a story of collective action and building on everyone else's work and connecting to other people's work, even in an abstracted way.
I think another important piece of this is the multimedia aspect of it, that if we think about how you tell biography or how you do an introduction to women's history in the 21st century, that doesn't include just reading books. It includes, especially for folks from the 20th century, seeing footage, seeing interviews, really understanding the person as a fully fledged human, and that means their voice and their mannerisms and their the community that they came from as well.
And we really wanted to focus on the things that women did throughout history. The scope of our exhibit covers 400 years of New York City and state history. We wanted to show that there is not one or two periods in that history where women suddenly sort of emerge into the story, that they're there all along, they're living through wars, they're going out to work, they're acting and doing and living in society just as men are, and they're contributing to that society even if their names are lost to history.
We also want to make sure that people don't think of these historical actors not in conventional buckets, right? You know, these are African American women, or these are women who are all women in business, or these are scientists, but rather to see different points of communion and communication and intersection between these people. So you might want to talk about the tags that really was a great point in the session.
Absolutely. The way the interactive functions is that you'll have the profile open up, and then there's different buttons to press. They're not really buttons, they're places you can touch, and you'll get information on that individual, and much of it is multimedia or scholarly talk, scholarly discussion on that person, or biography. But then at one point it says connect, and you get a word cloud of what we call tags of different things that connect to that person somehow. So if they're an artist, perhaps it'll say art or performance, but it might also say divorce or scandal or factories or other elements of that person's life and work. And then you touch on that, and it brings you to a tag page, sort of a timeline, where with a brief description of that tag, say it's factories, and then other people in the interactive who are connected with factories as well. So you can travel through time, in a sense, through these tags. And you could use it, you could be very focused on a particular topic and use it that way and keep going back to the factories tag or the scandal tag, or you can travel through individuals. And so we're trying to get people to think about these unconventional, I like the term buckets, these unconventional ways to think of an individual or an event or person, and to connect them through those ways. So you can look at artists, but and other people who've done art or other people who've done other things that connect in other ways. So unconventional buckets is a great way to put it.
But go on.
Oh, I think another piece of that too, though, is thinking about not sort of the identity markers of
That's right.
of who a woman was,
Yeah.
but of what she did. And one of the great points Joanna has made is thinking about not just the first woman to do something, but all of the support network and the other women, the second women, and also the women who built the structure that meant that that first woman could start doing that. And so when we start thinking about how do we teach women's history, if we sort of take this idea of this tag cloud and imagine being in the classroom, if you don't have access to our interactive, you can still use that idea, right? That what are the types of activities that different women have done, or the types of commitments they've had, whether to faith or whether they've been connected through scandal, sometimes which was created by the media, right, that it sort of affected them as opposed to their going out, although it was usually a combination. But these various ways to understand how women interacted with each other and interacted with men that tell the larger story of women's history.
I think also the value of that for teachers and students is this process of discovery, which is not like memorizing facts, dates, buckets, if you will, but really discovering a lot about people and their networks, and and very unconventional networks too, that we're kind of creating through this interactive, which is quite dynamic.
One of the habits of mind promoted by historical study enables students to recognize history as an evolving narrative constructed from available sources, cogent inferences, and changing interpretations. How do the ideas or materials discussed in your session incorporate and foster this habit of mind?
I think women's history lends itself extremely well to understanding that an evolving narrative does not always go in one direction. I think one of the things that is an advantage of our exhibit, but it's really informed by scholarship in women's history, is that we are not placing women on a timeline of linear progress. Women's place in society has always been both private and public. It has always been contested and in conflict, and women have always fought to be heard and to participate in ways that are not always, don't always look to us now, looking back, like progress, or don't necessarily look to us like equality, or don't seem to fit our own judgments, but we have to be aware of the different ways in which women interacted with their society. So I think simply by looking at the place of women, it's very clear, and it's one of the real values of women's history, that students do look at how stories can go sort of both forward and backwards. Progress can be undone. Women can hit walls and glass ceilings and concrete ceilings, and it is definitely not a simple march forward. So I think that's something that we really embraced in looking at thinking how to structure this exhibit.
Another thing that's come up in our discussions of the exhibit is there's often a focus in women's history on firsts. The first women to X, the first woman to Y. And instead, if you focus on an ongoing narrative that's building, it's important to think of, well, who was the first? Great, but also who was the second? Who was the third? And how did social structures evolve to support that new activity or that new kind of work and make it the norm instead of always having to have a first?
Or how did communities of individuals, groups of people, women in particular, become change makers, just sort of collectively? Collective action is a very important part of what we were discussing yesterday and what this interactive display discusses as well.
I think another piece of it that we discussed yesterday was what makes a woman fun, right? That's the title of our session, and sort of who has the power to call somebody fun or not fun, and what does that look like at different times and places. And so, again, thinking about teachers and the sort of habits of mind, where can you find the fun, or how do you understand the context in which a woman operated at a particular time and place to see what her options were. And I think that's one of the most important habits of mind of a historian, is to think about what, given the constraints of your situation, how do we understand the choices that you made?
Great. Another habit of mind invites students to discern differences between evidence and assertion and to frame useful and appropriate questions about the past. What specific questions might teachers use to structure lessons around the ideas/materials in your session, and how might students use these materials to frame their own questions?
I think that the main sort of, excuse me, I'll stop.
Oh, we'll start.
I would say that the main way that the subject of our session really sort of works with that habit of mind is for teachers to think about how students might use biography as a way into larger questions of women's history. Our exhibit is heavily biographical. We focus on the stories of around 70 to 80% of the content is in biographical information about individuals, and the other so it's which is a way of really of engaging students. They connect with the stories of interesting people. They obviously find it's a very good way for them to find connection with people in the past. And I think that what's really helpful is then for teachers to help students go beyond that biography and think about how did that individual's life look different or similar to the lives of women around her? Who were her friends? Who were her networks? What was her community?
Right.
And sort of build out from the individual instead of sort of treating individuals, famous women, the Eleanor Roosevelts, as these kinds of icons and outliers whose lives are sort of disconnected in some way from the world around them. So I think it's really about how biography can bring students into larger and more difficult questions about the structures of a society.
I think connected to that, getting back to the multimedia aspects of it, how can images, especially still images, be a really useful teaching tool, especially when you're thinking about biography? And how can you chart the way that a woman was depicted at a particular time in her life, how it changed over time, what was gendered about that, how was she depicted differently than a man of her similar status or a similar occupation or whatever it might be. So I think that thinking about a lot of the new visual thinking strategies and different pedagogical tools that folks are using in classrooms, here's this rich treasure trove of imagery that we've selected that with each woman there are multiple different aspects, multiple different images, different types of media in order to interrogate her, again, from the sort of 360 perspective.
One choice we made in designing the interactive was to avoid what we called identity tags. People aren't tagged by their religion or their race or their ethnicity. Instead, they're tagged by their work, their influences, and how they influenced. And so I would encourage teachers to think in those terms as well, to move beyond traditional ways of thinking about an individual or a group and expand the definition of who that person or group was. I can even imagine a classroom assignment where students may have done a biography of someone and then make another level of it where they have to come up with a list of tags for this person or group or event, and then talk to the other students and say, okay, who else does this? And then those groups, 3 students could get together whose people were all related to the military, for example, and they would then talk about how the military involved women or how that service changed over time. So however to interact with these connections instead of just the individuals in individual silos.
And in that sense, in that very sense, it shows the process of doing history. It's not about collecting facts that are just germane to one person or one event, but rather seeing a context in which the history happens. And this is the great value of what these tags are in a way, and it's showing the museum visitors as well as teachers and students how they can start thinking about the past. The one thing that came up yesterday too was the whole idea of badassery and how it's more fun to study people who have been a little bit more outside the norm and a little unconventional. And we sort of heed the pitfalls of only studying those sorts of people. We also want to be sure that our visitors, teachers, students know about the unnamed people. There are groups of people who will never know their names, people like the Irish servants, or who are some of the other big groups that we have.
We have a group of, it says, World War II workers.
Right.
For example, the classic Rosie the Riveter. We had lovely sources to work with, photographs and from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, so that was a really rich profile. And instead of focusing on individuals, the idea that this was a mass movement of people, of women working to build the material of war. Another group is Women of Saturday Night Live. We had these comedians. It was a funny group to do, but they've had a big cultural influence. So the idea of a group in that way, revolutionary spies, that kind of thing, you know.
And Stonewall.
Stonewall, exactly, as an event. Yeah.
So I mean, it's fun to start making those sorts of connections for students and for our visitors. Forgot what else I had something else to say, but I've forgotten. Anyway.
And that way you avoid pulling out the one,
right, the exceptional one.
The exceptional one,
yeah.
or the first person, and realize that it is about a group in that situation, and that it's about figuring out how these women work together, and how their influence was collective, and their network is what allowed change to happen, or what allowed them to have an impact. And it's not to diminish the achievements of individuals, but it's a way to avoid sort of creating hierarchies and have students think that only the most famous person, or only the first person to have done something is the name they should know, and the person who matters. That actually, in women's history, it's often the unsung workers who they should be really thinking through and paying attention to.
I think it's also important to think that this isn't, oh yeah, we're studying the Civil War and then we'll study the one woman, right? Here's the Sojourner Truth story. So that you can look at women across time and across space, and you can think about, we're really telling all of American history, or at least through this New York lens and through New York's women. But we've got politics, we've got religion, we've got, culture, we've got the entire music,
art.
We've got the whole gamut of experience. And I think that's, for many, I think, at least the way I grew up, it was always like, oh yeah, and then we'll do one woman, we'll feel like we checked that box off. And with this exhibit, I think we're showing, along with many of the other scholars who've written about it, that you can really tell the whole story through the experience of women.
It also, we also include, you talk about imagery, moving imagery, as well as audio, which, there are different modes of learning, and so sometimes you can read about a person, but you can actually see that person speaking. But this exhibit and our panel yesterday was informed by real scholarship in the academy. So even though we have sort of deconstructed these biographies, if you will, and thought about these people in just very different ways, we also have informed it with scholarship, and some of those very scholars are speaking about the people too on this audiovisual component, and that's very valuable too.
Right. Well, we have a few minutes left, so to wrap up, what question do you wish teachers would ask you about the ideas/materials you presented, and how do you respond to that question?
I think first we want compliments, because it's damn good. It's like, wow, you guys rock. I mean, really? You did that? You thought of that? And I think the process, we did show how the sausage is made.
Absolutely.
We did show the real seriously hand-wringing process that we went through to come to something that looks so effortless, and to show these connections in quite intuitive way for teachers. And I would hope that teachers can use that sort of intuition in a way, in the way they bring women's stories into their classrooms.
I would also be interested to have them ask, how will this kind of project grow? The way this particular installation is designed, we can add people and place. We're going to keep growing it more, and the network will develop. And so I would encourage teachers to think of, well, who else would I add? what would I put in? And because that's another way of interacting with the stories.
Well, sort of like our commentator, Valerie, who was fantastic. I mean, we didn't, she was sort of prepared, but she was
amazing.
Extremely prepared, but she'd never seen this interactive, so she was reacting to some of the bullet points we put on paper. And what was amazing, she totally got it. And she came up with a few comments of her own that would, why don't you include these two people?
And we will. They're amazing.
And she understood that. So if teachers could take away that kind of process of discovery and say, who would you add, and how do they fit into the parameters that we have established for this interactive? That would be great. And so they don't have to come to New York, the New York Historical Society, to interact with this. They can use some of the same processes that we came up with to, in their own classrooms.
To nominate more women.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Another thought was, Sarah's been talking about the multimedia. There were many moments when we didn't have an image of someone, especially from a long time ago, and so we had to use other kinds of things like a document or a map. And so I would encourage teachers to ask their students or themselves, well, how can I enrich stories of a time and place when there aren't the kind of media that I'm used to? How can I use a map of someone's town as a way to understand that person?
Right. Do we not include that person because there's no picture of them? Well, no, we've included them.
Yes.
Or because they're not named. We don't know their names, but they are included.
And there were a couple cases when we said, well, we don't have a picture of this person, but we have a picture of someone from a similar group, and we'll say so. This is not this person, but we can. So the idea of
this person resembled this.
Yes.
Yes. I always like being asked to pick favorites because I think we all have, in working on this over the year or plus that it took to develop, we all did a lot of research and I think found our favorites. So
And discovered new women who,
absolutely.
we had never known about.
Yeah, so it's always fun to sort of lead people to those names and faces who don't tend to make the history books, and so yeah, that's always a fun conversation to have.
By the same token, it's also about the process of discovery. I have a different favorite every time I pass the interactive, and some people, even on staff at the New York Historical Society, would say, "Who's on your list?" And I said, "That's not the point. It's not about a list. It's about discovering who's on the list and not knowing who's on the list."
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to sit with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.